Welcome to Go with the Workflow, where we interview world-class legal leaders and experts in workflow automation to learn from their hard-earned experiences in making work more efficient and more meaningful. Today, my guest is Stephanie Corey. Steph is one of those people who help shape and define legal operations as an industry right from the very beginning. She was an executive and founder of Clock, and was previously the Chief of Staff and Senior Director of Legal Operations at Hewlett-Packard, VMware, and Flex. But she hasn't slowed down. After being in the game for well over a decade, Steph today is the CEO and co-founder of UpLevel Ops, a widely used consulting firm that specializes in legal operations, and the co-founder of Link, a legal operations community who exchange insights, share resources, and frequently gather for events. And if you think she's only a badass at work, think again. Steph practices MMA, so she probably kicks as much butts as she kicks goals. On this episode, we talk about the importance of setting a strategy for your legal department and that it should be your guiding North Star for any technology roadmap that you build, and then how to craft that strategy, how to determine what initiatives to go for, and more importantly, how to prioritize them. And finally, we go through how to visualize and communicate your strategy and roadmap to get others on board with some real examples too. It was such an energetic and practical discussion, so I hope you enjoy this episode. Steph, thank you for being here and welcome to the show.
Evan, always a pleasure. We always have fun when we get to hang out, and I'm thrilled to be here and really grateful that everyone could join us today.
Amazing. This is going to be great. So today's topic, we're going to be talking through, the legal ops, New Year's resolution, and the roadmap that we're going to be building for 2024. We are talking about the roadmap today, but you once said to me, Steph, you said, don't let the tech wag the strategic dog. So
Yes.
let's start with talking strategy. Like, what does strategy look like for a legal department, and why is it important to have one?
Yeah, and it's so funny because one of the names in the chat that I see here, our participants, is Alexia Moss, and she's the general counsel that I worked with for many years, and she is the strategy queen of all GCs that I've gotten to work with. And what some of the stuff that we've done together is, the legal departments. Look, if you ask any lawyer, a lot of them don't even know what the corporate strategy is, right? And it's so, how do you provide really effective, responsive services if you don't even know what the real strategy is? And so the corporation is going to have a strategy. The CEO is going to have a strategy. And so it is so important for the legal department's strategy to flow from those goals. And so if it's like entering new markets or growing through acquisitions or whatever the corporate goals are, legal's goals should flow from that. And then the operational goals are going to be, okay, then how do we do that? So the GC using the corporate goals will and help from their staff and the chief of staff and all of that will come up with the what are we going to be doing as a legal department? What legal work should we be doing? That's the first question you should be asking in the first place. Is this a legal question or can it go elsewhere? Meaning an ALSP, another department in the company, automation, of course. So asking what that legal work should be to get the corporation to its goals. And then, of course, operations is what is the how. We come in and say, okay, now how do we get there?
Absolutely. I think that's really good advice. So if I'm imagining it visually, you're saying there's a corporate strategy, which you said, and that's sort of course, furthering the business biggest, most important goals. And under that, you have the legal department strategy that feeds up to that. Just probably like how all of our other, peers would design their sales strategy, their client success strategy, and all of those feed up to the corporate strategy. Legal is no different. And
Yes.
then underneath that, legal operations strategy should really support then the GC, the CLO in enabling that
You
kind of
got it,
cascade up.
Evan.
Right.
Exactly. And I think when we start repositioning ourselves, for so long we've heard legal's a cost center. We can never get the budget we need. And that that positioning was legal as the rubber stamp at the end of everything, right? Oh, legal has to approve this. No, we need to reposition ourselves. If you are viewed as a cost center and overhead, you're never going to get, frankly, the respect or the resources you need. And so, to the extent that we can change that conversation, and instead, legal is here to help you legally and ethically advance, right? Progress, move forward, get new business and get revenue in the door quicker. Those are the conversations GCs and CLOs need to be having. And then of course operations supports all of that. We figure out the how to get there, but it changes the conversation so that legal isn't that, the cost center. We need to move away
Mm.
from that.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's say you're looking to design a legal strategy, and maybe you're at the company all hands. Maybe you read the company strategy, manifesto, the document. Do you go from that straight into designing a strategy for the legal department, or is there a process that you go through in order to kind of design your legal department strategy? What's been your experience?
My experience, that's a great question. And I guess you can just do that, right? You can just develop a strategy based on, okay, here's what we need to be doing. From my experience, I think if you start with an assessment, you're going to get a better end result with your roadmap in order to get there. So the strategy is the end goal, right? This is, or I should say, you start with end goals. Like you need to know where you need to get, but then there's a whole gap that you need to bridge in terms of, okay, now how do we get there? And so for legal itself, once you figure out what your goals are, then you need to assess where you currently are, where your problems are, where the roadblocks are. And then that becomes the legal department's strategy to get to the end goal. So we usually do it, there's a million ways. And it can be, when you think about it in terms of like, okay, old school MBA, right? You're writing an 80-page document. Nobody should be doing that because, first of all, the strategy has to be really fluid. Priorities are going to change. There's going to be global events that happen that completely shift priorities overnight, literally. And so when that happens, this is really a fluid, living, breathing kind of document.
Mm.
And all it should be is really a visualization. These are not project plans. It's a visualization of what we need to do over the next 2 to 3 to sometimes 5 years to get to our end goals. And in order to do that, we have sample roadmaps and all that, which I know you're going to show later, but you really need to then you could go down deeper and break it out into, okay, these are the 10, 20 things we're going to be doing. And then of course you'll break it down and do project management for each of those, but it's really just, in my mind, you start with that assessment, you figure out where the gaps are, and then the solution to those gaps is really your strategy, and ends up being a roadmap.
Yeah. The comment you made around the 80-page sort of document resonates in a different way for me. I remember people used to talk about writing business plans when you start a
Yeah.
startup. No one's
Mhm.
going to write or read an 80-page business plan nowadays. And so they came up with this concept, which is the lean startup canvas. It's literally all of the key concepts, but on a single page. And so that kind of,
That's
that
exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, nobody's going to read a document and nobody's going to keep it up to date. So it's
yeah.
kind of a waste when you dive in that deeply on, any kind of project, yeah, program.
Yeah. And do you get a lot of the input onto that by having conversations with your stakeholders? Is that a mode of input as well for you? Like, are you conducting interviews or surveys? And typically, how broad do you go in that
Yeah.
um, in that sort of assessment in gathering the inputs into formulating that strategy?
It's such a good question. And we say you should go as broad and deep as you can afford to go. And what I
Mm.
mean by that is, this stuff takes a lot of effort and takes time. You're setting up meetings that takes an hour with each person by the time you really dive in and start having these conversations. And so it
Mm.
is a real investment in terms of time, your time and their time. But the more people you can talk to obviously the better information you're going to have and the more complete information you're going to have. And I think ultimately, then the better decisions you're going to make. So when we go in and professionally do an assessment, and again, this is stuff that people can absolutely do on their own, but it takes time, right? It really does take a lot of time to coordinate all of this. But we try to talk to as many people as we can within legal. It's important to talk to leadership, but we really want to get down and dirty with the people who are doing the work, because that's where you really see stuff that's broken down. There's so many workarounds that people do. They track stuff offline. All of this stuff really needs to be examined because it takes time and it needs to be calculated into the ROI of, like, I'll give you an example. One client that we had thought they were spending $300,000 a year on this one system. It was a big client. They're like, why should we rip and replace it? It's only 300 grand a year. It costs way more to rip and replace. And when we did the full assessment, what we found out was people hired additional headcount for the workarounds. They bought additional software to compensate for the lack of functionality in this software. People had like database administrators. There was so much offline work happening around it. It ended up being well into the millions of dollars that they were actually spending. And so, you really need to understand what is happening and calculate that into your ROI and whether or not it's worth. There's also fatigue in terms of people taking on new projects and new technology. So the culture has to be the temperature of the department, and the culture really have to be taken into account as well. So we really want to understand what's happening in the department. Then we want to understand what's happening outside of the department in terms of who's supporting the department. So like IT, what resources are available, what enterprise tools are available. We really get to know those folks. And then clients. And this is where sometimes GCs like take a step back. They're like, wait, you want to talk to our clients? But to the extent, look, this is information. When nobody wants to hear bad news, but it's so important to hear bad news, and because it's an opportunity, right? And it bridges a gap as well. So like when we start having these conversations with sales, we hear the same things over and over again. And I'm sure this would be a surprise to nobody on this call, but legal blame sales, sales is blaming legal, but when we could really dig down to the root of the problem, and fix these relationships. We had a client, they actually were an ACC Value Champion winner because the sales team, they would fight in front of the CEO. Legal and sales would be fighting. The CEO was getting really irritated. And we helped them fix this problem using an ALSP plus technology to really reduce the backlog. And then the sales team all of a sudden was like, we have the best legal team in the business. And so like it completely changed the perception of legal. And so I think, the more that you can solve some of these pain points, the better off your legal is going to look and be for the company, be of higher value. And so, but you can't even begin to solve those problems until you're having those conversations, and you don't get a full picture view, right? And then also sometimes what you realize, Evan, and this is so important for workflow as well, like we see legal teams trying to solve broad problems like across the entire company, when in fact we try to encourage them to kind of stay in their own lane. And so a good example of that is you don't necessarily need a whole quote cash to quote system in place, and like legal doesn't need to be doing procurement, whatever tool the procurement team is going to be using doesn't need to work with legal. They need to talk to each other, and that's important. But you want to also, while you're getting all of this broad information, you want to be solving for a more narrow, if that makes sense, for a more narrow set of issues, because you'll bite off more than you can chew. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's really important to solve for legal's needs as you're thinking about this, but knowing that these systems will tie into each other, whatever, you're solving for legal's needs while still having that broader picture view, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. And I've seen what happens, what can go wrong, I think, if someone doesn't end up taking the advice that you've provided there around starting with legal's needs, because as attractive as it is to solve for other department problems that may be, interrelated with legal, there's a lot of interactions between legal and the other departments. As attractive as that may seem, because then you might be able to get a kudos that's broader than just solving your own problems. Often a lot of the decisions or the controls over systems and decisions are not within your remit, and so you end up getting slowed down, or projects may end up being end up failing because you don't have full control over the outcome. So
Absolutely. I've seen it time and time again. That's exactly what happens.
yeah. Okay, so let's then tie up this strategy part of the chat with something really concrete. We're going to do something that maybe puts you in the hot seat for a little bit, which is let's do a live exercise together right now, Steph.
Okay, wait, I wasn't prepared for this. No, kidding.
Let's pretend that you and I both work at a company together, and the company strategy, the corporate strategy is, well, part of the strategy is to attain 80% growth in revenue over the next year.
Hmm.
What would be some examples of legal department strategic objectives and maybe initiatives to support, a company that's expecting 80% growth in the next year?
Yes. Okay, that's a great question. So, and it's one that, by the way, when you ask these questions, I would recommend for legal ops professionals to work closely with the leadership team and their GCs as they figure this stuff out. But there are team conversations to be had. And so one of the things instead of thinking about, oh, how can legal reduce costs, which I think is the place most ops managers go first, it's inbred
Mm,
in us, right? Like that's how we think we can cut outside counsel costs, but that's not where our brain should be going first. In fact, what we should be doing is a couple of things. Are we looking at breaking into new countries? Like maybe where we're not currently doing business? Are we looking at acquiring new businesses that are already there, and so growing inorganically, which is obviously a lot quicker than growing organically, right? So and another thing would be getting revenue in the door faster. So speeding the whole life cycle of the contracts, right? And also there's a lot to be done around contracting. And if you can look at deals in general and see, okay, we did all of this work and then it just fell off. If there's a way to do some analysis on like why do we lose that deal? That's not a legal, that's a business conversation, right? But legal can really facilitate that if it maybe the negotiation was too many red lines, too much back and forth, too difficult to do business with. There was no ease of doing business with this company because the legal team was too hard ass about stuff that frankly doesn't really matter, isn't really a risk to us. So there's a whole set of things that legal can do to really simplify the business process, and that's really where legal should be looking at. And so again, I think entering new markets, entering, new countries where you weren't previously doing business and figuring out what companies to buy, legal can really help facilitate. So, and frankly, isn't that more interesting? We're the business people for the legal department, right? As legal ops professionals. So those are interesting conversations that I think in the past we weren't really part of. We were very back end, just making sure the trains were on time, all still critical. But if we can be part of those conversations of like, how do we increase revenue for this company? I think that is a much more interesting place for both the lawyers and the operations people to be in. And again, it elevates the whole conversation. So that's kind of where I would start, where like, how do we facilitate getting revenue in the door faster? Honestly, more revenue and getting it here quicker. If the CLO GC is having those conversations with their business clients, isn't that better than no, you can't do that, or no, it's never been done like that before, so we're not even,
very
nobody
cool.
likes the department of no, right? So I think
Yeah.
having those different conversations are where to start. I'm curious if anybody in the audience has thoughts on that too. Yeah, and
Mm,
and Terrell here says vendor contracts are probably part of that. I would say all contracts are probably part of that, right?
yeah. I love that. That's yeah, like you say, it really changes the conversation. It goes from not just a department that is really important for managing risk in the organization, but now a strategic enabler. Like, how can we actually increase velocity or open up opportunities for the business from legal that
Yeah.
enable that kind of more growth orientated corporate goal? That's really
I
interesting.
I think
yeah.
Yeah, and Evan, you know what'll be interesting too, and we're going to see how this plays out because it's here already. But with the introduction of generative AI, especially too, I think where legal departments were valued before an outside counsel, frankly, law firms, was the analysis, right? Of, okay, this whole set of regulations just came out or whatever. And I think that's changing because now you've got technology that's going to do that in a snap for you, right? And so you're going to have technology that's showing you where risk is, that's telling you with this whole new set of California privacy laws, what does that mean for us? You're going to have all of that analyzed in seconds. And now I think clients want to hear from their lawyers. Well, they don't want to hear. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, this. No, tell me what I should do. Tell me what to do here. And
Mm,
so lawyers are going to have to be more consultative and act in that business consulting kind of capacity because everybody's going to be able, if they want to stay relevant, because everybody's going to be able to go to some LLM that everybody eventually is going to have installed into their companies at some point, right? And ask those questions. What does this mean for me? So they're going to get their legal answers. What they need is that interpretation. And what does that mean for them, in my mind, anyway?
yeah, absolutely. Okay, no, that's super interesting, and thank you for getting the hot seat there. By the way, we'll take you off. We'll take you off it.
Yeah.
Um,
No, no, and Alexia even made the comment too, like the more with less. I hate that as much as you do, Alexia. What is more demotivating? If somebody says, do more with less, I'm your manager and I'm telling you you have to do more with less, like okay, that is the most demotivating line ever, right? You're going to make me do more work with less resources. Thanks for that. And I love how Alexi says, just do less. I think that's so important that and that goes back to like what I was saying earlier too about like should legal even be touching this to begin with? Like we need to be asking those conversations. Like is this a legal question? And I have a lot of GCs say, "Well, we work so hard to get that seat at the table and we love to white glove everything." I get that, but if you do this stuff, like if you do the automation, if you do like the no legal's not touching that, we're only going to be doing this, you set up the right partners to do some more of the mundane work for you, the churn, then you're freeing up your in-house lawyers to have more time and more space on their plates or however you want to say it, and then they can be more business aligned and consultative, and they have more time to be strategic if they're not churning through work that frankly can be done by a tool or another partner or
yeah,
doesn't need to be done at all,
absolutely. I think a lot of the burnout and the overwork that happens in legal departments is because they're being so diligent and so diligent in the way that work comes in, and they kind of just work on what's on their desk, right? But they're not thinking strategically about what kind of work should I be doing and when, and matching the right resource to that type of work. And so that's definitely an area where you can get a lot of time back.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's getting the right resource, which is a tool, a person, a document, whatever the resource is, get having the right resource, do the right work in the right location, frankly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Hmm.
So let's say we now are clear on what our strategy is, right? People have followed your advice. They've looked at the corporate strategy. They've thought about it. They've done a 360 sort of discovery interview with all the different stakeholders, and they found how they want to design the strategy for their legal department. They want to then move into the road mapping part of planning, right? So if we think of strategy as maybe the end goal, like you mentioned, roadmap are all the initiatives and maybe timelines to get to that outcome, right? So kind of the plan.
Hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of times we may understand our problems very well, especially if we've now, interviewed a whole bunch of different people, and we may have a very strong empathy for the problems that we want to solve. But sometimes we may not be as clear as to the solution to those problems, especially when um, finding solutions involves going outside of the four walls of our organization to look at potential providers and technology and to know what's out there. And often, sometimes what we think we need isn't actually what we need. Um, so, what's your advice there? Have you seen this happen before? How do you ensure that you end up, onboarding the right like you even begin looking at the right set of
Yeah.
tools to solve the problems that you've identified?
Such a great question, and it's overwhelming, right? I mean, I just had a conversation. Like if you Google, whatever or Bing or whatever you're using these days,
Mhm.
CLM tools or whatever, you get 1,000 results back. Where do you even begin? What we end up seeing is you've got GCs or legal ops professionals who might be new to the role, or maybe they're totally seasoned, but contracts isn't their thing, right? Like not all of us are experts in every aspect of what we do. We couldn't be. It would be there's way too many areas that we would need to cover. And so, you talk to folks and you get this, which is important, but you need to do it in a controlled way. And what I mean by that is it's great to say, hey, what are you using for this? But their use cases might be completely different than yours. And so often and GCs will come back from a conference and they're like, we talked to, these vendors, or we talked to a bunch of GCs who are using this. And so we get called into, they've already signed the contract and now they need help with implementation or best practices, or they're realizing that like, oops, we weren't quite ready for this. And, we did it. And now what? And I wish that we got called in 6 months earlier, right? Because I I um I use the analogy of paying for the designer for the house. Like if you're going to do a full house remodel, nobody wants to spend more money than they have to. It's already going to be exorbitant and unpleasant, and you're going to be displaced, and everybody's going to be miserable. It's going to be dirty, yuck. But the end result is that's where you want to be, but do pay a little extra to get the designer in up front, because I went through a house remodel a couple of years ago, and having the designer tell me, you could get a ton more space if you do this storage space, or if you do that, you're going to save money here because blah blah blah. Or instead of going to the home store and picking out there's 150 doorknobs or whatever, here's five, you pick, I know your style now, you pick one of these five. Like it is so worth it having an expert who's looked at all of this, narrow everything down for you and get you to the right decisions. And at the end of the day, your result is so much better. I have a much more beautiful house with much better storage, higher quality everything, and I paid a little more and I'm so happy for it. And that is really how you need to be thinking of these things. It's exactly the same when you think about it. The content is different, but the process and the results are exactly the same. And so what I mean by that is we get called into like the 10-person legal department who's now implementing an iCertis, type CLM, where you're like, this was way overkill for you. And you're going to be spending way more money than you need on a tool. When in fact, all you really needed was a good workflow tool and a repository that you've already got access to. You just needs to be set up differently. And then you end up in this situation where your lawyers are trying to work in this complex tool. They don't like it. They'd rather just do email and Word or whatever. They didn't do that work of, it's the same thing when we talked about, doing that assessment and talking to as many people as possible. They didn't do the work of really talking to all the stakeholders, understanding what their business requirements were and understanding what their use cases are. And so it's so important in what we do, Evan, because you know this, because we've worked together for a long time now. We go into a client and we really dig in on what do they need, and we have, we're lucky because we have a team of experts, right, who have been doing this for a long time internally and as consultants. And so they know what questions to ask. It is helpful when a lawyer says, I need this, and we can dig in and say, but do you really need this? Or can this solve your problems? So it's helpful to have that expertise who, all right, this, if you need this, it does put you into an iCertis. But if we can get you there by doing this, then you're fine with the lower common denominator in terms of technology. So you need to know what questions to ask. It's helpful if you know that, but to the extent that you could really map out your requirements and use cases, which is so critical. What are the 3 use cases that you really need this tool for? And then when you go out and do the demos and to get to the tools, then that's fine to have those conversations. Like, hey, I really need a tool that does ABC. And then you have friends and colleagues from other companies saying, we use this tool or whatever. You use somebody like us, will we do all that research for you? Will we know the tools, right? So we could say, these are then the 3 technologies that you need to look at. But then the important thing, Evan, is they need to demo that to you. And the reason I say it, but and it sounds so obvious, but so often I think companies will, or legal team, this is not their expertise. By the way, I'm not like trying to sound mean, or whatever. I get it. This isn't what you do. I'm not a home designer, right? Like I didn't know what I was doing in that area, right? And so, really, what you want is you go to these tools and you say, what we do with our clients, but you should be doing this. These are the 3 use cases you must demo for them. And so, this way, when the clients look at, okay, these, they've done 3 demos, they can compare apples to apples because you can see exactly how each of these companies, these vendors do, solve for whatever these 3 use cases are. Then the vendor can show you whatever else they want to show you. But otherwise, if you don't control it like that, and it's so important, if you don't control it like that, what ends up happening is that the technology company will just come in and show you what they're good at, of course, and they'll show you like their AI is so great. Well, sure, because you've had it, you've done this demo a million times, and of course it's so quick because you've run through the same data set over and over again. So you really want to be specific with your use cases, and you want the companies to demo your use cases exactly as they would solve for them. And then you can rate and compare apples to apples. And then you do reference checks. And what I mean by that is they're going to give you, I say, hey, Checkbox, tell me, who we're thinking about hiring you. And you give me 3 companies who love you. Of course, it's like doing a job reference. I'm not going to give them somebody who hates me, right? I'm going to give them 3 people who adore me and they're going to say all these nice things about me. But then it really up to you to go out and sit and figure out who else they're using and find some colleagues who, will give you some honest feedback. They're not their flagship clients. And then this way you can really dig in and say, okay, what were the lessons learned? What was it like to work with them? What was post execution support like? All of it. So you can ask those questions. And I think that's how you get to a good solution for your company and a good partnership with that vendor.
That's incredible advice and so actionable. And I think you've really laid out sort of almost like this the procedure in looking at different tech. If we were to, because I know that you've said to me before, like a lot of people come to you maybe already having signed the contract or believe that they are in need of a CLM. And I think you used the example. It's a very common example because of all the noise around CLM nowadays. When do you know that you need a CLM versus say like a workflow tool, which often can meet a lot of the same outcomes and perhaps in different ways? Like, can you help people understand a bit as to maybe when a CLM is appropriate versus like when a more generic sort of legal workflow automation platform is appropriate?
Yeah, I absolutely. And it's a hard question to answer because there are a lot of factors that go into it. And I think some of it is based on, emotional stuff that also is, tough to kind of measure in terms of like what if you've got a team of people who have zero interest in technology, they're very set in their own ways. They've been negotiating everything in email and Word and all of that for a long time. You have to just, I'm starting there because I want to say, as an operations professional or as a GC who's leading this change, you're going to use chits in terms of saying you have to do this and change how you do work. So really understanding the culture and the willingness to do things differently is important, because if you've got a team who's just, it's going to be just so painful, then that's a clue to us that, maybe you guys aren't ready for a full CLM, and it's going to be painful because you're getting people to operate differently. And so really looking at willingness, I think, is important. My biggest failures in my career when I was in-house was like trying to shove things down people's throats that they didn't want. I knew it was the right thing to do. I knew it was right for the department. I knew it was right for efficiency, but they didn't want it. And so people aren't going to adopt if you don't do the proper change management. Now, sometimes you can do great change management, rally people, and there's literally experts out there who are change management experts who will help you like get your first champion on board, and then you could win more people over. But that's a lot of effort. So I think really understanding the culture is critical. And then you want to dive into what are your needs? And so a lot of times people will say, we need a CLM. That's 80% of the work that we do is contracting work in this department. But we also want to be able to track like how many requests for XYZ we're getting in, or we want to know like how long it's taking to get just basic legal requests answered. We want to know what work is going to whom. Work is coming in from every direction. We have no idea how to manage it. The GC will say to me, we've got outside counsel kind of nailed because we have a good e-billing system in place and we know what matters, our firms are working on and all of that, but I have no idea what's happening in my department, which is very common because legal departments don't usually track time, right? That's why everybody left the law firm, so they don't have to track time. Talking when I start having those kinds of conversations with folks, like I want to figure out, well, first of all, it's taking too long to get stuff done because it was sitting on, Sam's desk here for 2 weeks, but he was out of the office. And then when he got back, he realized it wasn't even for him. So he forwarded it to, Tyra, and now she's trying to figure out who the right person is and blah, blah, blah. It's all that back and forth. That's a sign to me that, okay, they're really looking at intake and workflow and speeding up those processes. If we're having conversations around, I need to know, and by the way, once we start having conversations around, I need to know what data is in my contracts. 2 years ago, that would have been to me a sign. All right, let's look at CLM and repositories and really figuring out post execution what's happening during the contract, negotiation process. But I would say things are changing pretty quickly. And so the AI that you've got now that can actually, once you get everything done and it's sitting in a repository, it is better now. Like, I would not have ever told a company years ago to implement IBM Watson or whatever the AI tools were, right? Because none of the legal departments I ever worked with, they didn't have the volume to train these tools, and it was not worth the expense, right? You could use a partner maybe that does that, but you should not be going anywhere near that. It's a different story now, right? You've got these AI tools that can read through, and that's what they do, data extraction, and they're good at it. And so even as we start talking about figuring out what's in your contracts, my brain doesn't automatically go to CLM then anymore, right? It goes to, oh, all right, data extraction and some AI tools might be interesting here. So it could be a workflow tool plus, just a good, or if the workflow has AI in it, great. But the tech is changing so fast that I find that it used to be more clear in terms of, oh, we need to know cycle times. We need to know, the contract complexity. We need to know this or that. That to me signaled CLM. It's very evident. Versus I just need to know what work is happening in my department, what work is coming in, where it's going, how long it's taking. That was a clear delineation, and now it's not as clear. So that is a terrible answer, I think, to a great question of it, the signals are a little bit different, and the technology is evolving so quickly. And I think even by the end of the year, it's going to look different than what it looked like last year and 2 years ago, that it's not quite as clear. So you really need to dig in and understand the use cases again, and then do the demos and see what gets you there.
I was going to say it feeds right back into your previous point, which is you're really going to be looking at your own unique use cases and requirements and challenges, and then having vendors come in and show how their product solves that specific problem. And the reference points, the reference customers are a way to kind of understand elements of like support and just generally how the life cycle plays out. But ultimately, you can't just rip out a vendor from another GC that you've spoken to at an event and say, well, because they're using it, we're probably good to use it as well. It's not that.
I think you're almost guaranteed failure if you do that, unless your departments are exactly the same and your culture is exactly the same, and your businesses are so similar. Okay, if you can find somebody that mirrors you, you might be fine, but there's too many variables that go into it.
Right. Okay. So let's say we're designing this roadmap now, and we know we've done that exercise. We know the types of technologies and processes that we want to implement on this roadmap. But like most cases, there are a few problems that we're trying to solve, and there's a few potential solutions that we want to implement. how do you prioritize? How do you know which one should come first and which ones you put, further down the roadmap? Walk me through the prioritization exercise.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it again, not to sound like a lure on the one hand, on the other hand, um, but I would say a lot of it does depend on willingness. Again, your success depends on how willing the people on your team are going to be to adopt everything. And so sometimes when we go in and do whole department assessments, and there's we find 90 things that they need to do, but we say to them, look, you're never going to get through these 90 things. We just want to highlight everything that we found, but there's going to be stuff that you just have to forget about and be willing to say you're never going to solve for that.
Mm.
But even within the top 20 priorities, let's say, we don't always go for the biggest bang for your buck initially. We say, look, what's the low-hanging fruit here where you're going to win friends? Because again, I am convinced that projects fail because of change management, not necessarily
Mm.
because of the technology, not, it's the proper change management, meaning you've got to get champions on board who are going to help you with this. It cannot all come from the ops manager. People will hate seeing you coming, you get to the point where they're like, oh God, what does she want me to do next? And so you really do need to have the right folks on, helping champion and helping you drive that change. And so a lot of times we'll say to clients, look, you need to do these, these 10 things are a must. You absolutely must if you want to get to your goal. And this one thing would save you guys millions. It would blah, 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 solve all of these problems, but it's a bigger deal. And there's an impact in terms of like time, and it's going to be kind of a pain. So let's start right here with this super simple thing. And if you solve for this, you're going to start to win people over. And I take the same approach when we look at, implementing tech tools. You're right. There's not one tool that's going to do everything for you. So sometimes it's like, let's take a workflow tool plus something, right? And so I think what you really have to do is, again, you're going back to your use cases and priorities. So if it's something that, like, if you have something that's really driving the team crazy or driving clients crazy and you can solve for that, that's the priority you want to tackle first. And again, you want it to be impactful. And so then that's the tool, going back to our conversation about don't let the tech tail wag the strategy dog. You want to make sure that whatever you're implementing is solving something. And so if the GC is like, I have no idea what work is even happening in the department. So let's do intake. Let's start right there because that's relatively easy compared to what it used to be, right? To get you in a good tool, to do a couple of workflows, to start building it out. And those types of things really build on themselves too. Because once people start to see the not only the value, but the benefit that they could get from it. Like, oh, I'm able to get all of this information that I was never able to get. And it's getting it out of my email, right? So instead of trying to recreate and track everything in Outlook, now you've got a tool that you're slowing down all these email conversations. And what was the last, conversation I had with this person or whatever? You're getting it into a centralized location, and then people will start to say, oh, you know what, I could submit all my approvals this way. Anything that I'm, whatever that I need an approval on, we can just set up a quick workflow for it. So those types of tools really build on themselves. That's why we're such fans. But I would say in terms of figuring out what to prioritize first, it's definitely whatever your biggest pain points are, but you have to consider those other things. Cost. Do you have the expertise to do it? Do you have the internal bandwidth to do it? Do you have the will to do it? And you can't discount those things, is what I'm saying. Like because it could fail miserably, frankly, if you might have the budget for it and everything, and then you find that just nobody internally, these aren't magic wand kind of things, right? It takes time and effort, and if you don't have that, it's not going to be successful.
Yeah. It sounds like if you had the luxury, going after the low-hanging fruit is always going to be a better option. The lowest sort of risky path to start building some goodwill within the organization through change and actually delivering value quickly. It doesn't have to be tremendous amounts of value from the get-go.
And I say
Yes,
like if you have the privilege, because sometimes, to your point, maybe you do have to deliver that big thing
you do.
and you have that one
Hmm.
shot. But if you have the choice, it sounds like taking the path where maybe you're not solving for the most important thing out the gate, but it's something that you can get out quickly and deliver value, build that goodwill, and then get more budget, more buy-in for the next project, and so on and so
Exactly.
forth.
And credibility, right? Because like you've solved for, and people are happy with, oh wow, yeah, they solved this little problem and then you get credibility and you build that reputation. And I think that that is really important. And you're right. I mean, we always say, I have to figure out a better way to say this because I don't know that it's the right way to say it, but we always kind of go for that lowest common denominator in terms of technology. Like if
Mm,
a simple, less expensive tool can get you there, that's what you want. You don't want the Cadillac if
mm,
I mean, it's overkill and lawyers don't like it, frankly. So you're increasing your chance of success with the lower common denominator. Somebody help me figure out a better way to say that, but I think you know what I'm saying. Like if a more simplistic tool is just it, people are going to adopt it. Think about your iPhone. You don't need a training team to come in and tell you how to use an app. It's obvious, it's easy, right? That's really where we're heading.
absolutely. Okay, so final piece is we've got we've come with the strategy, we've cascaded it down from corporate, and we've done all the interviews, and we've gone out and spoke to vendors, and we've done the rounds, and now we know exactly what we want, not because our peers are doing it, but because we've looked at our own use cases, our own requirements, and we've married it all up, and we've prioritized thinking about you know size of value and risk and all that kind of stuff. So then it comes to communicating that roadmap to your manager, to the CLO, to the broader business. How do you actually communicate your roadmap? And I have something here from you, Steph, that you sent me before. So I'm going to share my screen and pop something up. I assume this is what you shouldn't do.
That's right. This goes, but this is like the visual representation of our 80-page document that you shouldn't do, right? It's overly complicated. It's a mess. People will look at it and they'll throw up all over it, frankly. You'll get nowhere trying to shop this around.
This looks like the floor plans of like a train system or something like that. All right, but so we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this,
Mhm.
and you were kind to share with me also an example of how it could look like.
Yeah.
So walk us through this. How like what's going on here?
Yeah, so it's much cleaner, right? I think easier, visually more appealing, and it's just an example of what a roadmap could look like. And but one thing, and again, this is your one pager, Evan. You talked about it earlier, right? Like having that one pager of the strategy is so important for a variety of reasons. One of them being when somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, we need this," whatever they saw this beautiful demo of something, and we need to do this. Okay, but these are our plans for the next, whatever quarters, years, however you structure your roadmap. What needs to be bumped in order for us to do this, right? And then you can have that conversation of, somebody down in the organization isn't going to bump somebody's big project, up in the organization just because they want to get something done. But you can have those conversations around priority using a
Mm,
visualization such as this. And one thing that I want to point out that's important is you should include process as part of the technology. And so in the lighter blue, the aqua type color, these are really there, those are our process. So a lot of people just call it a tech roadmap, right? And we like to add in process because it's so important. It's so important and it's not fun and everybody hates doing it and nobody wants to harmonize templates and nobody wants to, process map stuff. But if you don't do that, your chances of a successful tech implementation fall greatly. And so, to the extent that you could really figure out, okay, we're going to do, I'm making this up, but if we keeping with our example of implementing a full CLM, let's say we decide we do need to do that, we're going to do that. We're going to be starting second half of the year or whatever. Then you need to be spending that first half of the year doing that readiness work, which is looking at your templates. Do you have process maps? Do you have rules of engagement for when to come to legal for contracts, or is it something that the business can do because it's a lower threshold? Yada yada. Those questions need to be answered first, or else you've signed a contract with these complex tools, usually pretty expensive, and you're sitting on it. You're paying for a tool and you're sitting on it because you can't implement it because you haven't done any of this readiness work. And so it's so important to include process as part of this, because it's a big consideration. Otherwise, people don't understand the complexity. They never understand, by the way. That's something that we're still trying to get, clients and in-house teams understand how difficult it is to actually do these things. It actually requires brains and hard work, and it's a lot, right? And so if you can kind of show them like, yeah, we can definitely do this, but you're looking at 4 to 6 months of work prior to actually implementing a tool like this. It's very, very important to show them that.
Absolutely. And I think it's I take the analogy when I see this and when you're talking about kind of like if you looked at someone's work calendar and you looked at all the meetings that they had in there, the blocks of, the blocks in the calendar, and you think, oh, there's gaps in between meetings, they must be free. No, but there's desk work, there's times to follow up emails and things like that. And
Yeah.
it's almost like unless you map out those types of areas of work where it might not be in meetings, but you're actually doing desk work and building a deck and whatever it may be, then you don't realize that there is actually a lot of bandwidth that needs to go into dedicating into that kind of work. And you end up misplanning. And so in the same way that you're planning a tech roadmap, if you don't map out the process work that comes before and after, then you're going to end up probably planning for more than you can actually consume, or you can't communicate how much work there actually is in delivering on the outcomes.
Absolutely. That's a great way to summarize what I just said. That's right.
Fantastic. And I think there was one more. This is just then drip feeding it into almost like a more narrow short-term roadmap.
Exactly.
Three down to one. Yeah.
And everybody likes to look at things differently, right? So I gave you two examples of you can, look at that overarching roadmap of, I think it was a 3-year roadmap that we were just looking at. But then if you really want to dive in deeper, and you could, if you're like a trained project manager for each of these, you can really go deep in terms of like building out tasks and yada yada for every single thing. But this is again just another kind of visualization of, okay, let's look at what our year one priorities are and what resources are we going to need. That's the question you need to then be asking. This is not just a pretty chart, right? It's okay, but what does this mean for us? Like how many people are we going to need on this? Do we need external help? Do we want to bring in, a partner who's going to help with this? And so that this should help you ask those questions of or when something comes along like a war in another country that we weren't expecting, and now that's, change, or a pandemic or whatever. How do we shift those things the right way without dropping important, things that we really do need to push forward?
Absolutely. Wow. What a conversation. We got there. We went from right at the very beginning, strategy, and all the way through to getting to that visual roadmap at the end. I've had such a great time on this conversation. I've learned so much just every single time I speak with you. I'm sure everyone else has as well. By the way, if you've never heard of Link and you want to get involved, definitely give Steph a reach out. And if you need anything help with your legal operations journey as well, UpLevel Ops.
We have a bunch of events we're doing. As you said, Evan, we're doing live events and we do webinars. And so it's a free organization. And the reason we started it was because, Clock is I still encourage clients to join Clock, obviously, and I go every year, but it's a huge organization, right? And so we wanted to have those smaller conversations, the smaller group conversations. When Clock was little and we had our very first meeting years ago at HP's offices when I was back there, and there were like 15 of us in a room, that felt great because you could like really share information. And so we try to do those local meetings now, and they're free to you thanks to wonderful sponsors like you, Evan, who pay for the venues and the food and all of that. And so please, it's open to we hope for a community of people who run legal operations. But if lawyers are out there doing legal operations, you're welcome to join. And we want to keep those conversations going. And like you learn from me, Evan, I learn from you, and I learn from every conversation I have with this community. And so we want to keep those dialogues going.
We're at the end, I think, of our session together here today, Steph. Thank you so much again for your time. Always really grateful to spend time with you.
Yes.
and
And
chat about all
as a
things.
professional, I mean, we stay vendor agnostic. As anyone who works with us knows, we don't get paid by the vendors to do any of the work we do, but we love Checkbox. We're big fans. And so that's my little plug for you. We love Evan. Evan's whole team is fantastic, and Checkbox is really, truly a wonderful tool.
Thank you. Thanks, Steph. I really appreciate that.
You bet.
All
Yeah.
right. With that, we'll close up. Thanks again, Steph, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you spending our time with us. All right.
Thanks,
Take care. We'll see
everyone.
you at the next one. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Go with the Workflow. If you found it valuable, you can subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app like Spotify or Apple Podcast. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leave a review, as that really helps other listeners find the podcast too. That's all for now, so we'll see you at the next episode.